The madness has finally started. Gonzaga opens up with Georgia. Welcome all in for another episode of the unofficial WCC Hoops podcast. We'll get into the matchup and lead that off with Gonzaga and Georgia. We'll talk a little bit about Santa Clara and their opening win in the NIT. We'll talk about Oregon State and Washington State, their participation in the college basketball crown. Talk a few portal updates as a couple more names have hit the list already. But of course, we got to start with the Zags, who do open up on Thursday at 1:35 Pacific from Wichita against 9-seeded Georgia. It is Bulldogs versus Bulldogs in this one, and the winner of this one will get the winner of Houston and SIU Edwardsville. SIU Edwardsville playing their first tournament game ever against the 1-seed Houston, so I think we kind of know how that one's going to go. So let's look into what we're likely going to see, or what we're possibly going to see in this game between the Zags and Georgia. And the quick synopsis on Georgia. This is a Georgia squad that is 20-12, went 8-10 in the SEC, was absolutely one of those bubble teams going down the stretch. Their head coach, Mike White, it's in his third year at Georgia after leaving Florida, where he was very successful with a couple of different Sweet 16 runs. And this Georgia team, when I start reading down the stats, their metrics, it's going to sound familiar. They were 26 in KenPom in defensive rating. Their opponent's field goal percentage was 40.9%. They're a top 100 offensive rebounding team. This sounds a little familiar, doesn't it? It sounds a little like St. Mary's. And obviously, if you're a Zag fan, hearing a team is like St. Mary's, considering even though winning the title game, losing 2 out of the last 3 this season isn't necessarily a great situation to be in out of a team that does maybe a lot of the same things that St. Mary's does well. However, I will say this. The one thing that Georgia doesn't necessarily do well is they're not as efficient as St. Mary's in what they do. They do turn the ball over a little bit more. They average over 12 a game. They don't shoot. They shoot about the same percentages, but they have way more ups and downs as we've seen throughout the course of the season. But there's a lot of talent on this team, a lot of athleticism on this team. And we'll start it off with the freshman forward, Asa Newell, who the Zags recruited heavily going into his freshman year this season. He does lead Georgia with 15 points per game, almost 7 rebounds, shooting 54%, a block, a steal. He does a little bit of everything. And one of the things he does exceptionally well is rebound on the offensive end of the floor. He is top 25 in the NCAA in offensive rebound, so that is obviously something that the Zags are going to have to pay attention to, even thinking about like a la Mitchell Saxon and what he's able to do on the glass. And the Zags still struggled in the championship game. They were still minus 15 on the glass despite getting the win. Silas Demery Jr. is another guy that the Zags are going to have to figure out how to manage. It's the sophomore guard, 6'5", averages 13 points a game, 149 free throws attempted. So he is going to try to attack the glass. He's going to draw fouls, and he's very good once he's there, 80% free throw shooter. So there's, to an extent, maybe some similarities there, at least in style of play, between he and Caleb Battle. Not that I think that those two are going to be necessarily the matchup, but there is going to be definitely something there as far as like how Silas Demery is going to try to attack the basket. And then one of the big three, at least the third leading scorer on this team, is Blue Kane, and he's actually been playing much better as of late on the offensive end. On the season, he was only averaging about 9 points a game, but over the last 8 games, he's averaging 13 per contest. He's shooting 49% from the field, up from his season average of 41. He does rebound it well for a guard, 4.2 per game. So there are a few guys on here that I think athletically are going to give the Zags a few problems. And definitely And it's not going to be something that they're unfamiliar with. Obviously, the Zags had a great non-conference schedule, and so they got a number of looks at different styles, whether it be UCLA or UConn or Kentucky, or like they saw some SEC teams as well. So it's not like that they're going to be surprised or overwhelmed by any sort of athleticism. The Zags team is too good to be able to for that to happen. But when you start to look at each of these pieces, it's what do the Zags have to do to be able to kind of get over the hump in a game like this? Now the Zags come in with a lot more experience than this Georgia squad. This is a very young team. Most of their top 8 are freshmen and sophomores, so there is not a ton of experience for this Georgia squad. And the Zags obviously are very senior heavy, whether they're talking about EK, Greg, Ajayi, Battle, Nemhard, Hickman. There's a ton of experience and tournament experience on this Gonzaga squad. So that is going to be something that heavily favors them. But now looking at the individual match, mention Newell and his ability to get on the offensive glass. That is clearly something that the Zags need to address, because that is something that they still did not do well against St. Mary's in any of the 3 matchups. And against a team that knows how to get to the glass, especially on the offensive end, this has been problematic. They have allowed too many second chance, third opportunities against even the likes of St. Mary's, where that is, if they need to close that gap. And even going into the championship game, that was something that Mark Few talked about as being a key going into that one, is making sure that they were better on the glass. Clearly, they weren't better on the glass, but they were better in a lot of other areas. And that you can't necessarily hang your hat on being able to be better in those other areas all the time. So something they do have to be better at is crashing the glass and preventing guys, especially on the offensive end, from getting back in there and getting those second, third, fourth opportunities, because we saw actually a few of those with St. Mary's the other night. And this is a similar component, is keeping Demery out of the paint. Do not let him drive. This is something, he's not an efficient scorer. He's only shooting 40% from the field. So you have to just make it more challenging for him to get those looks. Now, he can finish in a number of ways around the basket, and that is going to be a challenge for the Gonzaga backcourt. You'd imagine there's some level of combination of Hickman, Nemhard, and probably Battle are going to have to mix it up there and force him into more difficult looks. But that is going to have to be a key as you prep for this Georgia squad and what they're going to be and what Demery is going to do to try to attack the basket. And it's not even just attacking the basket getting by the guards, but it's also the potential of getting someone like, say, a Graham Ike, who has the tendency to get into foul trouble. You have to make sure that he stays on the floor, because that is almost where the Zags can get into bigger problems because of the defensive problems that Braden Huff has had over the course of the year. Braden Huff wasn't used a ton last year in the NCAA tournament. He did still have a good game against Kansas, but the other 2 games, McNeese and Purdue, he was not used all that much, mainly because EK was able to stay in the game and was wildly effective in the tournament. And it almost feels like, more than anything for the Zags, it's using that experience to keep their composure. Because this is a young Georgia team, because this is an experienced Gonzaga team, the Zags are the ones who know what this is all about. They're the team that knows how to advance to the second round, to the second weekend, to the deeper and deeper into this tournament. This is habit for them. They've reached the Sweet 16 9 straight years. They were with largely the same group, won their first game against McNeese a year ago, beat Kansas to move on to the Sweet 16 before they lost to Purdue. This Gonzaga squad knows what they're doing in March. And for this Zags squad in particular, because this is one that has been much maligned because they couldn't get the quote-unquote big win. They couldn't beat UCLA. They couldn't beat UConn. They couldn't beat Kentucky. They lost 2 out of the 3 to St. Mary's. You look up and down, it's like they had multiple opportunities. West Virginia, another one. to get good wins, and they just could not cash in a lot of these opportunities. Almost none of those opportunities. It's outside of Graham Ike, who I know is going to show. Outside of Ryan Nemhard, who I know is going to show. Who is going to come along with them? Is it Ben Gray, who had a good tourney last year, but has been very up and down the last couple months? Is it going to be Caleb Battle, who, if he can continue the performance he had in the WCC tournament, the Zags are going to do very well. But if we see the battle we saw at many points in WCC play, it's going to be a struggle. Are we going to get the good version of Michael Ajayi? We don't know. How much of a factor is Braden Huff going to be? And I feel like he may only be a factor in this game if EK gets into foul trouble. Now, one of the guys I think that a lot of times is overlooked and can be forgotten when it comes to talking about who's going to show up or who's reliable in certain situations. You know who was one of the most reliable guys in the tournament last year? It was Nolan Hickman. Nolan Hickman averaged nearly 15 per game in the NCAA tournament. He had 17 against Purdue. He was arguably like the second best player throughout the course of the NCAA tournament for the Zags after Graham Ike. And him coming into his fourth NCAA tournament, a tournament where he has done well in, he's not going to be fazed by this. And I actually expect him to have another good game, being that third option, that fourth option, depending on how the Zags rotations go. As much as we talk about how he hasn't met many of the expectations that others have had for him over the course of his career, you know where he shows up is in the tournament. And there's nothing more that actually you probably can say is the fact that he does it when it matters most. And he did it a year ago. This is a tougher first round matchup than it was last year. I did think the McNeese matchup was way more lopsided onto the Gonzaga side, even though everybody was picking McNeese. This one is going to be a little tougher. This one's going to play a little bit closer. I don't think the Zags are going to run away with this game. I think this game could still end up being a little bit of a higher scoring game. I think the Zags have played that slower pace against St. Mary's, and I don't think they're going to allow that pace to be played in this game. I think this could still be one in the 70s somewhere, not a classic Gonzaga game up in the 80s or the 90s, but this is one where I think that they can actually get Georgia moving a little bit more and take advantage of some of those early opportunities and really work inside with Graham Ike doing what he does best in these biggest stages. And then also, I mean, one of the other things is, and it's something that has been brought up, harped on as well, is can they win a close game? And this was something I talked about going into the WCC tournament, something I talked about late into the regular season because of that number, and you can skew it however you want. Still 0-7 in games that either are decided by 6 or fewer points or in overtime. Well, even though the game against St. Mary's was a 7-point difference, to me, that felt like that counted. It felt like every time St. Mary's made a push, it was thwarted. Every time that it looked like St. Mary's might get within a basket or two, the Zags answered and got a couple of their own. And even though, yes, they had chances to turn it into a blowout, really stretch out that lead of theirs, they still won the game. And they still won it against a team that really just never went away in the Gales. So I do think that they have actually done it already. I do think they've actually closed out one of those games. Could even make the case that if you want to go back to, let's say, the USF game in Spokane, that they did it then as well. Even though the final score didn't end up being close, you looked at the way those games were played up until the last few minutes, it was a 1-point game, a 2-point game, a 5-point game. It was within 3 possessions. And that is where I can look at Gonzaga and say, no, they actually have won the close game. And they should be able to handle that again in the NCAA tournament. I do think they're going to be able to handle Georgia. I do think they'll move on to the second round to likely play Houston in that matchup on Saturday. So going into this one, I think there's a lot that the Zags have going for them. There's definitely some things that they need to do better at to make sure that they do close this game out. But their experience, their ability to just control the game, to control NCAA tournament games is going to show in this first round matchup, and I expect them to advance in the NCAA tournament one more time. Now, a few notes that are also going out. So College Basketball Crown announced its bracket, and both Washington State and Oregon State are in, as are Boise State, Nebraska, Arizona State, Utah, a number of power conference schools, which is what this tournament was going to be focused on, is the power conference teams that missed the NCAA tournament, the ones that also decided to not go to the NIT. And Washington State opens on March 31st with Georgetown, and they'll play the winner of Nebraska and Arizona State. Oregon State opens with UCF, and they open on April 1st and will play the winner of DePaul and Cincinnati. Now, this is portal related, but a point I made the other day about the College Basketball Crown and when this thing starts. Again, March 31st, April 1st, are when the first 2 games for these 2 teams are. I broached the question, who's even going to be playing in these games by the time that date rolls around? When I'm recording this, we are on March 19th. We are still 12 days away before there is any game in this tournament. And already there is one Washington State player who has hit the portal, and that is Isaiah Watts. It's not a terrible surprise that players are going to hit the portal. It's not a surprise that teams that are involved in this tournament are going to also leave. But this is the start of what I was illustrating in the problem that this tournament is going to have. You wait so long to start that tournament. You just give more and more opportunity for players on that team to hit the portal because the portal window is so much smaller than it has been. And yes, the portal hasn't officially opened or whatever else, but they have every intent to hit the portal. So who is actually going to be on that roster? Who's actually going to be there? Even head coaching changes could end up changing how these teams look or how they're going to end up playing. And I was joking around with it over the weekend in Las Vegas about when this tournament happens and everything else. Considering how many people are going to hit the portal, you know what they should just do? It should just be, all these squads should be team manager games. That's what we should do. Just have the team managers go out there 5-on-5 and play. That might be honestly more entertaining because I know they're not going anywhere. They're still going to be at that school, at that university once the dust settles. So let's make it more entertaining. Let's do something like that because I don't see how this is going to be all that entertaining once we get to the last week of March, when really what we're all focused on is the Final Four. That's what we're focused on. All the basketball world will be focused on those 2 games, the 2 games of the Final Four, and of course the championship game. Yes, these games are not on the same dates or whatever else, but really, I just do not see it. I do not get this one. Now, I think a tournament that actually does still carry some weight, at least is pretending to still matter, is the NIT. And Santa Clara opened its bracket with UC Riverside on Tuesday. And I said that there was no way that this game was going to end like their last one because they played in the non-conference. And Santa Clara won that 96-54 back in November. These two teams were very different then. UC Riverside probably played its worst game of the year. They shot 29%. They were 4 for 31 from the field, or 4 for 31 from 3. Santa Clara was 12 for 22 from 3. Sounds a lot like Santa Clara. They were plus 17 in the rebounding column, all that sort of stuff. It was the most lopsided loss for Riverside, and it was the most lopsided win for Santa Clara against a Division I team. Well, it did end a lot like the first one. Santa Clara won 101-62. Riverside shot better. They shot 39% from the field instead of 29%, but Santa Clara shot 60%. Santa Clara made 12 threes in the first matchup. They made 16 this time, including 9 for 11 in the second half. They had 7 different players hit a three, 5 in double figures, led by Tyree Bryan with 17. They just took it to Riverside one more time, and it just felt like a mirror image of the game 5 months ago. And I didn't think it was going to be that way. I don't think anybody thought it was going to be that way. And sure enough, Santa Clara puts up another 100-point game. They hit a ton of threes, and they will move on in the NIT, and they will host UAB in their second round matchup. Game date still TBD on that one, but it will, I think, be at some point this weekend. And just a couple more notes on the portal. I mentioned Isaiah Watts. He's not the only one that has hit the portal. The other one is Jackson Olvera from Pepperdine, the second wave to hit the portal. He did score 27 against the Zags in that first couple weeks of conference play, but he averaged 5 points, a little over 5 points per game on the season. The freshman hitting the portal, so Pepperdine is going to be looking for at least 2 new players as we enter the transfer season, which is only a few weeks away. All right, well, that'll do it for this episode of the unofficial WCC Hoops podcast. The St. Mary's preview will be up right after this, so both of them will be up simultaneously. Talk about St. Mary's and the Vanderbilt matchup. That one, we do have an interview from Locked On Vandy podcast host, Corey Burton. So he'll be on. We'll chat with him and go over everything about Vanderbilt and what they are bringing to that matchup in the 7-10 against the Gales. All right. Be sure to hit the subscribe button and follow along on social media at Post by Zach and at unofficial WCC Pod. The tournament is here. Zags and Georgia, Bulldogs versus Bulldogs on Thursday in the first of the 2 WCC matchups in March Madness. All right, well, that'll do it. Thanks for watching, everybody, and I will catch you later.